Well, good morning. Welcome to Contribulet's second webinar. For those of you who are familiar with Contribulet is a new online fundraising platform designed to help businesses better manage fundraising events with local schools and organizations. Integrated with the Clover point-of-sale system, the Contribulet platform provides businesses with a one-stop solution for managing their fundraising requests. More information about the platform can be found at www.contribulet.com. With that, I want to move on to our discussion today, which is on fundraising in the Bay Area. I am really excited to have such an esteemed panel here with me today to talk about fundraising. Let me introduce our panelists. I'll start off with Bev Lenihan. Bev is a consultant for nonprofits, focused on planning and managing strategic programs designed to accelerate and sustain their success and service. And to date, she has assisted nonprofit clients in raising over $90 million to help others. Bev is a past president of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Silicon Valley chapter, as well as a past president of the Rotary Club of Cupertino. Welcome, Bev.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Next up is Anne-Marie Meacham, who is Executive Director for the Fremont Union High Schools Foundation. She's also the founder of Meacham Communications, an organization that oversees and implements fundraising strategies, including annual plan development, event oversight, and grant writing for local nonprofits. And Anne-Marie is also a past president of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Silicon Valley. And finally, welcome, Anne.
Thank you.
Marie. And finally, we have Josh Selo. Josh is the Executive Director of the West Valley Community Services. He is the President-elect of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Silicon Valley chapter.
There's a theme here.
There's a theme here, yes.
Little plug.
He's also a nonprofit executive with more than 17 years of nonprofit experience, with a real focus on strengthening communities, supporting families, and engaging volunteers and donors in meaningful philanthropic programs. So welcome, Josh.
Thank you.
So I'm really excited about having a discussion about fundraising here in the Bay Area, and if I would start off with a more general question to the panel, and talking about how has fundraising in the Bay Area evolved over the past 1 or 2 years?
Well, I could start that out. In my experience, even over the last decade, there's been quite a movement from a reliance on grants, be they local, county, or federal, to an appreciation that agencies really can't rely on that for their long-term sustainability. That they do have to develop a more local and individual presence. So that emergence of individual donors and what they care about and working them in more close relationship with the agencies is certainly a trend I've seen in the last decade.
Okay.
I think we're in the midst still of the economic recovery, so there's been a lot more availability of dollars around, both from individuals and from government entities. We have a lot of tax dollars that are available. The county has been very generous. Individual donors are equally generous, and so we've been able to do new things because there's been more people to bring in and engage in the missions of our organization. For us also, we work in the area of housing insecurity, food insecurity, and that's on the tip of everyone's tongue. It's in the paper almost every day. So we've been able to benefit from the zeitgeist out there in the community and sort of tap into one of the issues that people are really thinking about.
So for your organization, you're actually finding it easier today to raise funds?
We personally are finding it much easier because people are talking about food instability, housing insecurity. It's not something I have to educate people actively on.
Right, and for those of us in the Bay Area, I think we're all well aware of the high cost of living and some of the real challenges that we're starting to see in the Bay Area. So let me ask you, transitioning over to looking at some of the top challenges that you might see today as you look at kind of the whole area around fundraising. So does anyone want to?
Yeah, I can start with that.
Okay.
I think one of the biggest challenges we see in the Bay Area in particular is that a lot of the money raised here doesn't stay here. The recent Giving Code report indicated that more than 90% of funds raised by private foundations are actually dispersed outside of our community. So being more competitive, collaborating, trying to think in different ways to attract funding opportunities is really an important concept.
The other thing that I notice is that people with passion want to start up a nonprofit. They think it's pretty easy just to start up a nonprofit and go out and ask for money it'll come in and you'll be able to,
Wave your magic wand.
realize what it is you want overnight, and it's actually very hard work. And what happens is folks may not get grounded in some of the ethical principles and process to really do sound, sustainable fundraising. So, if there's a concern, it's that folks think before they jump and really get a good grounding in what they need to do. Right now, we have way too many small agencies in our area, and it's diluting the resource that's available, not only of the financial resources, but time and talent of people being available to do the work or even volunteer to do the work. So sometimes partnering, and as you mentioned, Anne-Marie, and collaborating might be easier to achieve the end than actually starting up a brand new nonprofit.
I would also say employee retention is an issue. We're at a time of very low unemployment. I think hiring fundraisers, hiring executive directors has always been a challenge. Bev, you probably have more perspective on that than
It's true.
I do. But even now, it's more difficult because there are so few qualified candidates. There are so many nonprofits. And the average tenure, I think, for an executive director is 3 years, and for a development director, about 18 months.
Yes.
18 months.
So that kind of turnover undermines the ability for a nonprofit to have sustainable growth, high level of programs, serve the community. We need to try to get to a place where there's less turnover. Our leaders can stay longer supporting their organizations, making relationships that develop and strengthen a nonprofit for a long time.
So what do you do in situations like that where you've got this, as you mentioned, this issue with attracting and retaining talent? Given the fact that it's a very competitive environment and you've got, sounds like a small pool of candidates, what are the strategies that you're pursuing to kind of make it work?
Well, in my experience, one of the biggest opportunities is for boards of directors to actually do their jobs. And, their job really is the overall governance and sustainability of the organization. And that really gets back to identifying, hiring, and retaining the right kind of leadership for the organization. So their number one job is to find those and find those leaders, and then to provide the tools for them to do their best job and to continue to nurture that leadership so that they really want to stay there a longer period of time. Often they abdicate those roles for leadership right back to that senior executive, and they're looking for a partnership with the board, and it may not be happening.
I would agree.
So Bev, you consult a lot with different nonprofits. Is this a common problem that you see with boards, that they're not clear about what their mission is and what they should be doing?
I'd have to say, recently I've done this exercise in asking boards, could you recite your mission statement? And it is amazing how few of them really can. So my encouragement is that they bring it, the statement, to each board meeting and actually read it, every board meeting, and then talk a little bit about what that means, or have someone from the staff or one of their clients come and actually talk about how that mission gets fulfilled in the work they do. That reinforcement of mission for sustainability is critical, and it also relates to the ethical viability of the organization as well. You always have something to check against. Are we doing what we really need to be doing?
I think it's also when you have board members, though, these are typically high performers in companies. They're used to getting things done, right? And so they want to do that. They want to get things done, and they struggle with the governance role versus
the management
the management role.
I think it's a delicate balance between the management and governance, and I'm often educating my board members and clients also to really understand who has daily responsibility for operational oversight and who really is in charge of the governance. And you have to keep going on that educational process. It's not a one-time proposition. It's constant, ongoing education.
So it sounds like it might be a real challenge trying to, how do you manage the board? How do you manage the composition of the board to make sure you have the right composition so that you can achieve your organization's objectives?
I think with a good partnership between the ED and the board chair and the executive team, it's less difficult.
Okay.
As long as you can have open means of communication and a conversation around what this really looks like, And if they all agree, then you can help the rest of the board understand what the proper separation is.
Okay.
Yeah, it does start at the top, of course, and just like with our major donors, we want to have a really good relationship with them, any donor. And so if it isn't reflective in the organization and its leadership and the staffing, then it's going to be very difficult for it to be reflective in the donor relationships. And they take nurturing, and they take longer than people think they do to really build the trust and respect and the following that is sustainable. And often we want to, jump onto one little fast crowdfunding campaign and say, okay, that'll do it.
Yeah.
And it'll do something. It's got its role, but it's just not everything.
Right. Okay.
I think something Bev touched on that is really important in fundraising is all about the relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So with those important relationships with a fund or a donor or whatever, you can continue to expand what they're interested in supporting.
Mm-hmm.
I often hear, call Facebook, call Google.
Yeah.
They'll give us all the money we need. And the reality is if no one has a relationship with anyone in that organization, it's wasted time.
So speaking of relationships, how are you managing those relationships? I mean, what tools do you use?
I know one that he
There-
uses.
Yes.
So many.
So there's so many choices. So many choices of different
What about
things.
your notes?
So we use a cloud-based donor management system, and we endeavor to record every interaction we have with our donors in there. Now, what I've heard, sort of the wisdom I've heard is don't put anything in there that you wouldn't want a donor to
That's
see.
true.
Yeah.
But we also spend a lot of time thinking about how many times are we interacting with our donors on an annual basis. How many times are they hearing from us? What are they hearing? For every ask for support, how many reports back are they hearing about the impact they had on our work, on the lives of our clients? And then you do things like, how many times do you use the word you in your donor communications? Do you focus on the donor's role in the experience as opposed to what the agency accomplished? So there's little tricks you can do to make sure that every time you communicate with your donor, you're really focusing on how they're having an impact, because that's what they want. They want to have meaning. They want to have impact. They want to make change.
It's counting the donor touches,
Yeah.
touch points before. You can't just, the first touch point after the thank you letter shouldn't be, and now I need more money. It needs to be, here's what you did and thank you so much. And there's studies on how many touches you need before you can actually ask again where the donor will respond positively.
And the best touches are stories.
Yeah.
Stories that really
Absolutely.
epitomize what it is you're doing and how you do it, and what the results are. That's really the impact that people are looking for. And Josh writes great thank you notes. I
Oh,
just
thanks,
have
Bev.
Not only thank you notes, but encouragement notes.
I
And
agree.
I think anything like that that's very personal and personal to that donor is going to make a huge impact, and it's just going to reinforce their good decision making, and then they'll be open to whatever that next ask might be.
So speaking of donors, we know that not all donors are created equal. So how would you define a good donor?
Oh, I want to touch that one.
That is a very complicated question.
Well, one thing I know is I experienced this when I was working with one of our clients. I actually got to go on this client call, and the donor was very clear about what was important to her. She said, I've been thinking about the tour I went on a couple weeks ago and what we saw and everything, and it's getting close to what I care about. But I'll tell you, I'm really concerned about, and then she went on to be a little more specific. And so then I said, I'm interested, why is that so important to you? So I was able to draw out her story about why that was important to her. Well, we got a lot of information that day about not only what she wanted to focus on, but why. And it's the why that gives you the clues as to how they want to engage with you, and how they might grow with you. A lot comes from just getting them to tell their stories, and that's a good donor, when you can get them to actually open up enough to tell you what they really care about. Not only that, but why.
Yeah.
Why.
I like when they make the transition from saying your organization to our organization.
Yes.
Okay.
And that fills me with an
That's
enormous
huge.
amount of excitement and pride and joy. Just that one shift.
That's great.
It's a big shift.
Yeah.
I mean, I can see that if you don't have the information, you're kind of just throwing darts up against
Yeah.
the wall here, trying to make sure you hit
But
the
I think
target.
as fundraisers, it's important for us to help them to draw that out.
Mm.
And it's really, at the end of the day, it's all about what they want and
Yeah.
what difference they want to make in the world. It has very little to do with the individual organization or whatever it is. It's really what they want.
Right.
Well, the best donors usually start as volunteers.
Mm.
In some way or another, they get involved at the grassroots of how the agency functions, how the organization works, and the work you're doing, and they get to see it hands-on. And oftentimes, that's when they really get touched with something that's very important to them, and it becomes real, and they begin to see how it matches up. So often, that volunteerism, that involvement, really does breed a very good donor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can see there might be some challenges where a donor will say they have specific requirements before they would make a donation, and it's got to be tough, right? On your side of trying to figure out how far do you bend? I mean, at what point do you say?
That's why that
pass?
mission statement
Yeah.
is so critical.
And a gift acceptance policy.
And a gift
Yes.
acceptance
Policy.
policy and following the ethical standards.
Yeah,
Yes.
of the profession, absolutely.
All of those have got to be your watchwords.
Which is something like the organization of AFP would really help, right, as far as providing some benchmarks.
Absolutely. Yes, the Donor Bill of Rights, it's called.
But they have templates also for gift acceptance policies, and I'm sure we've all
We
had
use them all the time,
experiences
yeah.
where we've been approached by a donor and been asked to, they've offered to make a nice gift
Yeah.
with strings attached, and we've had to decide, is that in alignment with what our agency would be doing? Does that make sense? Is it ethical? And sometimes that means you have to turn down a gift, which is what it is.
Yes, and sometimes they'll give a gift, and then they'll come back and subtly start asking for more and more and more as a result of that initial gift. And then they'll promise another larger gift if you will just kind of meet these demands. That can be a slippery slope, and we've experienced several of those. And they become very uncomfortable because often there are people who are highly visible in the community and have a lot of means, and it's very uncomfortable to have that conversation to say, I'm sorry, but this is not fitting. So the more documents you have to show why it doesn't fit, the easier it is to have
Yes.
that tough conversation.
So speaking of donors, we know that, at least in the press, we know that donors have been asking for more transparency and accountability. And so I want to ask you, within your organizations or your experience, how do you define success?
Well, I think you need to define it early on as you work for, what it is you want to see accomplished. For me, it's always started with a vision. What is your ultimate vision for that client you have or that work you're doing? And usually it's so far off that it takes a very long time to get there. So what are those incremental successes along the way, those benchmarks where we can say, we're on our way, we're getting there. And if you don't go through that period of evaluating and really thinking that through as a board, as a staff, and checkpoint on that regularly, then you can get off base real clearly, and it doesn't happen.
We've used our strategic plan actually as a tool for this. We engaged in a 6-8 month process to identify where do we want to be over the next 3 years, and we identified metrics, a combination of outcomes and outputs, a little more short term. And then now we've been able to work towards those. We've aligned our board and our staff, and we're all rowing the boat in the same direction. And we actually did a 6-month report out via webinar to all of our stakeholders to let them know this is where we stand, this is what we've done. It's been a new way of communicating, and I think people have really enjoyed this report out on what we've been up to.
Okay,
I think
great.
that's great.
Impact's important too. So it's beyond, what program deliverables have we done, but out in the community, out in the world, what difference does the change in that one person or that one group actually make on our economy, on our whole culture, the setting in which we live and function every day? Is it really having a financial, economical, psychological impact? And that's harder to get at. You have to really work at thinking, how will we measure that? And that's what what major funders are actually looking for today.
Yeah, those donors want to understand, right, how their contribution is really making a change out there in the
Mhm.
world.
Yes.
Well, we have a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask you a very important question. What are the top 3 things that nonprofits should do to be more successful?
So I'll start with that one. Well, I have 2 actually. One is love your donors in all ways. So send them little thank you notes. Really focus on the difference they're making in your organization's life. And if you think about the relationship, about what Josh was saying, it's not about you or your organization, it's about them and loving them, sending donor love notes and things.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, I would say carefully select your board of directors. So you're in alignment with the culture of philanthropy, and really creating that culture of philanthropy within that team is really critical, I think,
Okay.
from my perspective.
A couple great points there.
Well, you picked 2 of mine.
Okay.
And I think we've talked about it, but being ethical, always having a standard of excellence based around your ethics, which means having a set of values that you've identified, written down, and everybody understand. That again is a guidepost to being successful.
Assessment would typically be posted in a public place.
Absolutely.
Where all employees and volunteers would
Yes.
understand.
It's a mantra.
Okay.
And talk about it at every opportunity,
Yeah.
every all hands meeting,
Mhm.
all the time.
I also think you need alignment between your leadership, your board chair, your ED, and your development director all have to be aligned as it relates to fundraising, goals, approaches. I think executive directors need to be involved in fundraising and not just in setting strategy.
Yeah.
They need to be actively involved. It means so much to have an ED sit down with a donor and talk about the vision for the agency and what their investment will make. And too often EDs delegate those responsibilities to their development director and say, this is your job, not my job. And I do not agree with that in any way. You need a trifecta. You need your board chair, your development director, and your executive director working in lockstep to fundraise to support the work that your agency is doing.
Fundraising is a team sport.
Totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It seems like it makes a lot of
It's a
sense.
team sport.
That you walk in the
Definitely.
shoes and everything.
One of the things I could add there, if
Yeah.
we have a moment,
Yeah.
is when staff sees that there's the trifecta that is really functioning well and happy about that, they too are much more eager to spread the word about the agency they work for, the organization they work for, and they become friend raisers for
Yeah.
the organization, who
Yeah.
eventually become volunteers, who eventually become funders, who eventually become long-term donors. So it's catching, you know,
Right.
when things are humming,
Mhm.
it's catching and everybody feels good about the work they do.
That's a great point.
So let me ask you another question then. What advice would you offer someone who is interested in pursuing a career in the nonprofit sector?
Anybody?
Anybody?
I'd say take it seriously. This is not just some easy little part-time something to think about. It's hard work, but I also think I had 27 years working in the high-tech world, and then I've been very fortunate to have this second opportunity to have 15 years working in the nonprofit field. I wish I would have discovered this earlier. This is my heart's calling. This is what I've been meant to do, and now I have the opportunity to do it. But I think I would have had such a much happier life if I would have done this a long time ago.
Well, we also benefited from having Bev. You know, I would say my advice is find a mentor. And
Absolutely.
both Anne-Marie and
Both
I
of
have
us, yep.
benefited from Bev as a mentor. I think you have so much to learn from people who've been in the field for longer, who have experience, not only being a fundraiser, but being a fundraiser in this valley.
Absolutely.
And can just share so much wisdom that will help you in your career.
And I think that's a great point, not only about Bev, but when I said, well, how do I pay this forward? And she said, find a couple of people at an AFP event and take them to coffee and see how now you can then impact their lives. Because our relationship with Bev, and I know Bev has these amazing mentors all over, mentees, it really can mean the difference between a meaningful career
Yeah.
and one that might not be as robust.
Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
And I could say, when I first joined AFP, I had a wonderful mentor,
Oh,
and
see?
Sharon Svensson,
Yeah,
and you know, I learned so much in such a short amount of time, and it just gave me the confidence to move into an area where I knew no one, and no one knew me. And when you're grounded in how to do the best work you can do,
Mm-hmm.
then, you know, you've got not only that mentor, but you've got your own building blocks that they've
Right.
helped you identify, and then you can move into it. Yeah.
I will say fundraisers typically are the nicest people. I've encountered such wonderful, kind people.
Do you think you might be slightly biased?
Maybe. But even in conferences all over the country that we've all traveled to, kind people, they really want to help you. They want to,
Yeah.
if you have a question about how to do something, they will do their best to share their best practice with
They're
you.
generous. They're very generous.
Very generous is the perfect word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what we didn't mention, but we talked about before, was the idea of making sure you connect to something you're passionate about.
Absolutely.
You know, I've had an experience in my own career where there was a disconnect. I was raising money for something I wasn't passionate about, and you can tell. You know, Anne-Marie was saying before, you always sort of feel it in the back of your head
Absolutely.
that there's something insincere about it. It makes it hard to be successful.
Because donors tend to be very perceptive, correct?
Oh, yeah.
Without a doubt.
And so if they don't sense that passion coming from you,
Mhm.
they're like, well, why should I give to this cause if you're not passionate about it?
Mm-hmm.
Usually they can really sense the passion when you have the story to tell and you're willing to tell it.
Mm.
Yeah, because a lot of times people are reticent because maybe it's not really their story. Yeah. But when you own your own story, then you're passionate about telling it, wanting to help.
To anyone who listened.
Yes, Josh.
In every means possible.
So I guess one last question. I am curious for your respective organizations and experience. When you look at fundraising, what really has worked for your organization or in your experience has worked? What's an effective thing to do?
Face to face, maybe not even if they're not a donor yet, but a one-on-one coffee to take out a prospective donor or prospective board member. That face-to-face contact, I found there's nothing that substitutes for that. No matter what it's about, if you want them to join your board or you would like them to join, donate to your cause, whatever it is, that first initial meeting has really proven for our organization to really move them down the process and support your organization.
Okay.
Know the work and do the work.
Mm-hmm.
You really have to continue to not rest on any laurels, but know that there's always going to be more work to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, you know, it's relentless, but the opportunities are vast. So it works for you if you're willing to do the work
And have a plan.
and have the plan around it.
Yeah, I mean, and we already said donor touches. We plan out every single communication point, every single touch a year in advance, and we know why we're doing it, what the purpose is doing it, what our goals are associated with it, and so that we can see at the end of the year if we accomplished our goals, if we followed our plan.
Right.
I agree. An annual fundraising plan is critical, and also when you're working with your board and they have this what may be a very wonderful idea to go do something else, you can go back and rely on that board-approved fundraising plan
Sure.
that says, remember how we said we were going to do these 3 things, so we'll think about that idea, but in the future, because this is what we said. Because fundraising, you can easily get off on a different tangent, and can suck a lot of time.
Right. I guess when people usually hear about fundraising, they always think about going and asking people for money. We had a discussion earlier that that's not really what you're doing when you're fundraising, right?
Mhm.
You're really being a connector between
Absolutely.
someone's passion and an
Mhm.
opportunity to do something that's really going to make this world a better place. And that's what you're doing. You're being a matchmaker, really.
Absolutely.
And you're helping them live their values. You're helping them create a world that they want to see through making an investment in your organization.
Right. And I guess your challenge is then saying is what they want to do aligned with your organization's
Absolutely.
mission.
Yep.
So you better be a good listener. You
Yeah.
better ask good questions and
So that's the key thing,
Just-
right? Is having good listening skills to
absolutely.
understand
Yeah, absolutely.
what's important to the donor.
Yes.
There's a lot of clues in this conversation.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Great discussion with all of you.
Thank you.
I really
Thank
enjoyed it.
you.